Well, good morning all. Thanks for joining us this morning. And we're continuing the Hydrock webinar series on climate emergency. This session is focusing on what developers and their design teams need to do to prove that they can deliver on net zero. I'm Stuart Grant. I'm a consultant with Hydrock, and I'm absolutely delighted to be hosting today's discussion. I'm no expert, but we've brought together a diverse panel, get your teeth in, who are definitely experts, as well as being passionately committed to the climate agenda. You'll meet them shortly, but just to briefly introduce them: Alison Ogley, partner at Morris LLP, a specialist advisor to clients in all areas of planning and environment law. Emma Cullen, Chief Operating Officer at Fiera Real Estate, responsible for driving ESG across Fiera's portfolio. Rebecca Lydon, Principal Consultant at Hydrock within the Smart Energy and Sustainability team, advising on major master plan developments across the UK. And Sophie Pine, Sustainability Consultant at Hydrock, also within the SES team, advising developers across new build and retrofit projects. Now, it's a massive subject, of course, to cover in 45 minutes, but we're going to spend about half an hour exploring some of the key current issues before opening it up to your questions. So if you've anything you want to raise, please post your question in the chat room and we'll pick up as many as we can. And please add your name and your organisation. Thank you. Despite a year of lockdowns and Brexit angst, 2020 saw a ramping up in awareness of the climate emergency and how our built environment needs to adapt and adapt quickly to the challenge of limiting greenhouse gas emissions and global temperature rises. And that's with buildings and industry contributing almost 40% to those greenhouse gas emissions. There's no doubt that this is top of most people's agenda now, but it's a complex, challenging, quickly changing, and dare I say it, often confusing arena. So we're hoping that the panel can help demystify some of the issues around this and give some clarity to what lies ahead. I mean, do we just need to work more collaboratively? I can't speak this morning. Do we need to work differently? In parallel, and because this webinar has attracted such a diverse audience with a broad range of experience across the property and construction sector, we'd really like to seize the opportunity to get a snapshot survey of how you're all feeling about the race to net zero. So there's a link in the chat to this survey. It's only 3 questions. It's really straightforward. But what we're intending to do is analyse your feedback together with the conversation that takes place today and create a collective sort of mind map to illustrate the issues around shaping climate resilient buildings and communities. That survey will be open until 6 p.m. on Thursday, so please get involved and we'll share that back with you in due course. So let's get on with it, and working on the premise that it's okay for me to be slightly confused on this subject, where to begin. I'm going to start with you, Emma, if I may. Just set the scene for us, please. What changes have you seen in investor appetite for climate resilient green development over the last couple of years? What are the priorities of the developers you're involved with, and how are they responding to this challenge?
Morning, Stuart, and morning, panel. Well, as the Chief Operating Officer at Fiera Real Estate UK, I have both the benefit and the delight of working with our operating partner network, and that comprises a number of entrepreneurial and regionally based development companies. And together we have been through a year, as you've mentioned, Stuart, marked by disruption, and we have seen real estate become a rapidly transforming asset class, and that's been driven by UK legislation, but it's also been driven by investor sentiment. And I think that where there used to be a perceived risk of investing in an ESG product, this has been replaced by an approach which recognises the role of non-financial performance within investment, as well as the correlation between sustainability and investment return. And as a business, we have seen a significant shift in investor appetite towards talking with us about our ESG strategies and our roadmaps. And investors clearly want to be part of the decarbonisation conversation, and they expect us to be part of the solution. And from the perspective of our operating partners, they are looking in particular at renewable energy solutions, better battery storage at sites, where possible dual metering that defaults back to the grid, where on-site energy reserves need to be recharged. But strategically, I think they're also looking to enhance their own sustainability credentials through the evolution of net zero carbon roadmaps, and they want to work with funders and investors who recognise that sustainability now needs to sit at the heart of the development process.
Well, we've come a long way, haven't we? That's a pretty good opening and a broad summary of the distance we travelled in a relatively short period of time. Alison, if I can come to you, in terms of project viability, is the CapEx premium to achieve net zero standards stunting progress, as it probably was 5-6 years ago, or do you think there's general acceptance now that this needs to be looked at in the round and, as Emma says, considered against the long-term benefits of reduced operational costs and enhanced end value?
I think there's certainly more of an acceptance now than there was, that these costs have to be absorbed, and businesses are having to find ways to make sure that they can absorb the costs in an effective manner as they can. For me, I think there is a big viability issue there for developers. If moving slightly away just from net zero and into more of the wider climate change challenge, if you like, part and parcel of dealing with that is the Biodiversity Net Gain initiative. And if you look at the government's impact assessment on that alone, we're looking at a 200 million annualised cost to businesses for delivering biodiversity net gain. Now, different developers are going to be affected differently by those costs. And in some cases, especially for sites that are heavily constrained, or if you're dealing with big distribution developments, warehouses, or city centre developments, where there's not a lot of room, so you can't do a lot of on-site mitigation, there are real concerns about viability. And I think, you know, there's going to have to be a piece on those as we get more to grips with how that system will work. How are you going to be able to buy biodiversity credits, for example? What's the market going to look like? And then, of course, for developers, that has to be balanced against the other financial tolls, if you like. So you've got community infrastructure levy, affordable housing, other sections 106 agreements. So, you know, there is a real divergence, I would say, across the development industry as to how capable different developments are of absorbing those additional costs. And I would say the first thing that any developer needs to be thinking about is that to get it right from the outset and make sure they consider that when they're looking at option agreements.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Rebecca, I'm going to come to you. From your perspective, what are the foundations for making any scheme climate resilient, and how do you plot a course over the lifetime of a development when the effects of climate change are a bit uncertain? And is there a common theme around what you can do first, whether that's developing out a single office building, a residential block, or a multi-hectare garden village master plan? Sorry, I think I've asked you about 3 questions there. You want, Rebecca?
Well, I think, you know, my immediate answer as a sustainability consultant will be to engage early, you know, with advisors. And I think before that point, it's viewing that climate challenge also as an opportunity to sort of rethink our relationship with energy and you know, wider development principles. But, you know, net zero is kind of a starting point for the wider discussion. So when we're thinking about energy, it's the how and the where we generate it. It's the when and the why we're using it, and then it's, you know, how can we be more efficient with it. So part of that is sort of collaboration and communication with you know, throughout the value chain, throughout the supply chain, and then also sort of working with the data that you've got. So I think a common theme for me is around sort of benchmarking. I did a module at university that I still remember to this day called evidence-based decision making, and it's something that's really stuck with me. But if you don't understand what your climate risks are, if you don't understand what the opportunities and constraints, you know, in the physical sense of your site are, you know, things like power network capacity, and then how can you define your targets and respond appropriately. So I'm not sure whether that answers all of your questions, Stuart, but I've done my best as an opening gambit.
There's stuff I'd like to come back on, but we have to keep moving as well. So thank you for that. I set myself up with that, with all those questions. Sophie, coming on to you, and in terms of verification, as we know, there are a number of sort of design and environmental modelling assessments that have been, some of which have been around for 20 years. So obviously BREEAM, WELL, LEED, Passive House, and more recently the sort of the launch of Neighbours in the UK, the Australian model. Do all of these systems have a place going forward, or does the fact that there's more and more of them add to the complexity and potential confusion? So, for instance, could one unified system cover all the bases and help to develop a consistent understanding and approach? Any thoughts?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. There are a number of accreditation schemes, and I guess at the minute it's down to sort of the project decision on which system's the most aligned to demonstrate what their desired sustainability outcomes are. I mean, schemes like WELL and also FitWell, you know, again, this is a performance-based system, but it's focused on the internal environment. So that is specifically looking at factors that can impact on the health and the well-being of occupants. And especially after the past year, I think that's something that will rise quite quickly in interest in the UK. But then we've also got the holistic environmental assessments. So that's your BREEAM and your LEED, which cover a wide range of issues, different categories such as ecology and energy. But in the UK specifically, BREEAM has always had the leading presence. The BREEAM schemes are very flexible and can be used across a wide range of projects now. And this also includes, so the refurb and fit out projects, it's probably going to be one of the most challenging aspects when we're looking at net zero. So the BREEAM schemes can also provide a certification for a refurbishment scheme. So that's, again, with the interest in that sort of scheme has risen significantly within the past 12 months. So there's also been, in the past, there's this gap where we don't have accreditations for the post-occupancy reporting or the validation. So where we've had, you know, in the past we've had this gap. Last year the Neighbours Scheme was launched in the UK, and this is again a very different scheme to BREEAM, because it is looking at the actual impact of the building and the actual energy consumption, and it has been very successful in Australia, which is where it's come across from. And I think they were quoting that there's been, I think it was the energy savings, it's driven by 30 to 40% reduction, which is massive. And that is such an exciting scheme that's come across, hopefully, to be uptaken in the UK, because this is where we are missing out on driving down the energy consumption of our buildings. We need to be able to, we can't manage what we don't measure. So something like this is going to be vital moving forward to net zero.
So what I mean, you're really saying it is horses for courses. Really, you need that broad range. Anybody that's googling Neighbours with the mention of Australia, it's not spelt as Kylie and Jason. It's NABERS. But moving on to legislation and policy, Alison, you're definitely your area. But the area is in flux, isn't it? It's definitely complex. It's confusing and it's awash with U-turns. So I think in the last week we've seen the Green Homes Grant system scrapped after only 6 months. 6 months after it was launched. How do you steer your clients through what's potentially a minefield? Do we need more clearer legislation to drive awareness and adoption, or do we still need a mix of carrot and stick?
Well, just taking the first question first, in terms of how we advise our clients, I mean, the first part of that is that we have to keep up with the pace of the change. So it's critical to have horizon scanning so that we can know what the future direction of travel is for our developer clients, and we can advise them appropriately so that we can look at securing the optimum scenario. Obviously, when we're involved on the planning side of a project, you could be looking at a planning permission crystallising 3 years ahead of where you're starting. So you've got to have that future scenario. It's even more important if you're advising in terms of a local plan that's emerging, because again, you might have a 25-year plan horizon depending on the particular plan that you're looking at. So as part of that, it's absolutely critical to have a network of technical experts that they are also on the top of their game, and you can tap into that resource, and you've got to be able to work as a team, I think, to advise your developer on that particular project to make sure that it's got its best chance of achieving what it needs to achieve. We certainly need some clarity in terms of the legislative framework. There is obviously a massive lacuna at the moment in terms of Brexit and the continued delays with the Environment Bill. The government needs to remove uncertainty. Uncertainty is always bad for business, and unfortunately at the moment that's all we seem to have. We just have big gaps where obviously we had a system that we've been used to working with for nearly 30 years that's suddenly really been removed from under everybody's feet in terms of the EU relationship. So yeah, some clearer legislation, some actual progress on things like the Environment Bill would be absolutely key. Some codification might be helpful so that there's less things in different places, bring things together, be a bit more cohesive. But often what I find as well though is that the law's a bit of a crude tool 9 times out of 10, and what you really find is that the industry is often leading the way, I think, in terms of climate change and net zero, rather than being forced by the law to go down that particular pathway. I think the stick's always going to be needed to some extent. There's always going to be those that need the stick to sort of, depending on their business model, it might not be as easy for them to do, so they may well wait until it becomes mandatory. But that again is a bit of a sledgehammer to crack a nut, and it also depends on effective enforcement, which can be a challenge where we've got regulators who are underfunded. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. I need to keep moving. Emma, from your perspective, in the run-up to COP26, it's going to be a big year. It's going to be a year likely to be full of announcements. What do developers need to be most aware of? And do you expect any game changers in the way that schemes are brought to the market and developed out in the next few years? Will developers who don't have ESG governance become unfundable, for instance?
I mean, if I'm honest, Stuart, I think that as a developer now, if you aren't embracing ESG, then you're putting your capital at risk. In terms of what will be a game changer, I think that Rebecca earlier hit the nail on the head when she started to talk about data. And I think that a lot of developers don't have an awareness of the power of their own sustainability data. And it's the data that they can collect project to project, which needs to inform their own decision making as they transition to net zero carbon strategies. And as Alison has referenced, we're subject to so many disclosures and standards. you very much need to be able to evidence to investors and funders that you're setting meaningful standards of performance against which your own environmental impacts can be measured. And you can only set meaningful targets to reduce carbon if you understand what your baseline data looks like. So I think data is hugely important, and people need to identify the right data sets, and they need to start working out how to capture them, collect them, and then how to visualize and analyze them.
Yeah, okay, thank you. I'm just going to try and move on to best practice and share some examples of that. So Sophie, how do you see that developers are sort of driving and embracing best practice on projects? I'm sure there are plenty of exemplar projects out there, but are they getting enough profile? Could there be more collaboration, sharing of information?
Yeah, it's a great question. We've seen this massive shift in attitude and change in the past year, and I think the main thing that's driving the best practice for the people we are working with is, again, it's dropping back to what Rebecca and Emma have said about being able to collect the data and undertake a benchmarking exercise. If we don't know what the performance of the base build specification is, then we can't look to where we need to improve it. And it's so important to understand where we are now to be able to start mapping this pathway to net zero. And until we start doing that across the board, it's going to be difficult to be able to drive the best practice across all projects. But we have seen an increase in terms of internal targets and this holistic approach. It's not just about net zero, and I think it's key to remember that. We also have to consider the wider climate resilience that we need to be incorporating into our designs now. So there's things like biodiversity, which is incredibly important and will be going forwards. It's looking at things like materials and waste, but there's also coming into the thing coming in about the circular economy. So there's an awful lot to go at, but we are seeing there's a massive drive in this now, and people are doing this, which is great, but it's not always shouted about. So there are a number of outstanding projects, but it's not necessarily getting the coverage that it should do. But hopefully moving forwards, we are going to have this collaboration and knowledge sharing across the industry, because we need that. We need to be able to share the data that's collected to be able to design and construct in the most practical way possible.
It's definitely an area where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. Everybody contributes and shares their own best practice, and you get a lot back from everybody else. So I think that seems to be a theme that's coming through already. Rebecca, so developers are obviously starting to see sustainability as where they can achieve commercial gains from. It's not just a cost, but it's a commercial world. So where are they starting to look to secure the long-term value from their schemes?
I think, when we're talking about value here, the emphasis is on sort of the economic side, and I think probably just worth pointing out that there's a social and environmental value as well that probably isn't picked up within this question. So making sure that we're not leaving people behind, and sort of embedding that concept for investors, and then that this is wider than just energy, so in terms of making meaningful impacts, but from an economic perspective, there's sort of there's a market appeal and an overall increase in end value, where we're dealing with net zero opportunities, but going forward, I think we're looking really at sort of the carbon and the energy markets for developers, and sort of the opportunities in the future with energy suppliers to sort of offset supply and demand. So some of it is around cost avoidance rather than revenue, because non-energy costs are rising quite rapidly. So The other area then in terms of long-term value is around resilience of supply. You know, that mix of energy generation, storage, active network management. It's essentially future-proofing all these developments so that they are still able to operate in that net zero world in 2050. So I think, you know, that's commercially where we're at, and a lot of the things that we're involved in are around finding that appropriate mix on sites.
Yeah.
So
okay.
hopefully that answers the question again, Stuart.
Thank you. So I need to keep moving because we've just given ourselves such a short timescale for this. But Alison, I want to just move to the public sector, and you work a lot with local authorities. I just wondered, is there a consistent way, and we've got a lot of local authorities on this call today, which is great. Is there a consistent way that local authorities led by government policy are seeking sort of information and plans and evidence from developers? The majority of them have declared climate emergencies, but are they clear as to what they want from developers, who of course want commercially driven plans to create the sort of and regenerate the new areas? Just have to mention at this point that I've really been impressed recently listening to some of the net zero carbon retrofit programs from the likes of Nottingham City Council and Enfield Council, and they are way ahead. And today we're mostly talking about new build, but there's a lot of good work going on in retrofit. What's your thought, and what's your advice in terms of how best to work with local authorities?
Well, so in terms of our practice, we tend to be on the other side of the table to the local authorities advising the developers, but there is a real absence of consistency, unfortunately, and a discrepancy between levels of understanding and expertise at local authority level. And that isn't a criticism, it's just an observation. And I think it's a reflection of underfunding and the problems that have arisen through scrapping regional planning that happened back in 2011. I think it's a legacy issue, and it varies from authority to authority. So as you say, you do have some councils who really are leading the way and are very switched on. There's also a national attempt, I think, at the moment to try and standardise a little bit more. So we've got things like the National Model Design Code, which is being consulted on at the moment. But again, how successful that will be, I don't think you can have homogeneity across the whole of England in terms of design and net zero, because different areas are going to have different abilities to deal with different technologies, and they'll have different types of design issues to deal with. I do think it can be unwise as well to sort of impose uniformity. There's a real need for developers and local authorities to work together, I think, and learn from each other, learn from the leading industry leaders in the development sector on net zero, what can be achieved and how it can be measured, because actually those parts of the development sector can help local authorities devise tools that can actually help get the baseline, just like everybody else has said. Sophie, Rebecca and Emma, couldn't agree more. The baseline data point is absolutely critical, and the industry can help with that. Okay,
that's great, thank you. Just sort of looking ahead, sort of coming to the conclusion of the of my questions to the panel before we open to the floor. Most and many organisations are looking to 2030 as the watershed for all new build development to be net zero. But when you take design into account, which needs to be a year or so ahead of that, we've only got 7 or 8 years to crack this. Are we on track? And what's the weakest link in the chain to us achieving that? So I'm just going to look to come to a couple of opinions on that. Anybody desperate to answer that question? Alison, thank you.
I mean, I'd say one of the biggest obstacles, at the risk of going, back over old ground, is past mistakes. It's scrapping things like Code for Sustainable Homes, the funding initiative that you've just mentioned for renewable energy, and for householders being scrapped, all of that sort of thing is very negative. The National Design Code itself is only setting out a stall for net zero by 2050. So I just don't think there's enough commitment and ambition at the central level.
Okay. Any more for any more, Emma? Thank you.
I mean, I think it's really important to highlight your frightening statement, Stuart, that if we're going to aim to halve the GHG emissions by 2030, we only have 7 or 8 years left of current carbon budget at the current emission rates. So I think the weakest link in the chain, it's not only time, but it's also the way that we approach working across the value chain. As you say, knowledge sharing is so important, and we have seen a shift in the real estate industry trying to set longer term goals. But to achieve these ambitious targets, we're going to really need to change the way in which we work. And we have to acknowledge the role, the sustainable role of all providers to a project. And Alison talked about having a network of technical experts, and we have to be able to change so that we work across that supply chain, that value chain, if we're truly going to meet the UK's targets.
That seems to be, thank you for that. It seems to be a massive theme coming out of this morning's session. Rebecca, I'm just going to come to you briefly before we then hopefully pick up on all of you on the last question.
Yeah, I wanted to be slightly flippant because, you know, as an industry, we're still talking about having 7 or 8 years to design to net zero carbon. But from a technology perspective, there's no reason why we can't design for it from tomorrow. You know, the technologies we need exist to do it. So I don't think for me it's about one weak link, it's almost remaking the chain, because the part of the issue is around energy use intensity, and that, you know, for a long time we've consumed a lot more than we need, and we've got to address that at like the core of everything. I've seen an analogy about us being at an all-you-can-eat buffet and kind of pigging out until we're so big that we can't move, and thinking that that's okay and it's normal, and in reality it's that cultural change that we need, and that's part of that chain, but not necessarily one part of it.
That's good, thank you for that. I'm just going to come to my final question. I know you weren't making a reference to me with the all-day buffet. Back to COP26 in Glasgow, big year. I just want a really quick answer from each of you, if I may, as to what for you is the one thing you'd like to see come out of that conference in Glasgow in November this year. Sophie.
I guess in one word, unity. It's a global issue. we can't avoid it. So, you know, if we could unite, it'd be great. I think there was a lot of unresolved issues from COP25. So yeah, I'll keep it short to that.
I like it. Thank you. Rebecca.
Strong climate leadership from the UK, because so far it's a bit hit and miss.
Okay. Alison.
I think for me, what I'd like to see to come out of it is placing the power of nature at the heart of being able to deal with climate change adaptation, and having a real commitment to that in terms of funding and delivery.
Okay, thank you. You're being very obedient and summarising quickly. Emma.
Well, you know, maybe we'll get a new buzzword from the conference, because we've seen the meteoric rise of net zero carbon in the last couple of years. So I don't know, maybe we can replace big data with something along the lines of big battery. But in reality, we're going to get more legislation, but hopefully we will get improved benchmarking, and we will get more of a standardised framework so that we can understand better how we measure embodied carbon.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. I'm just going to move on now, bearing in mind the time, pick up some questions that we've had from the audience, and thanks everybody for doing that. And please continue to add your questions on, and please don't forget to look at the survey. I've had 2 questions from Andrew Weston, so I'm just going to pick one of them, and I'm going to pick do we think the government need to provide an incentive in carbon tax to even the playing field? Who wants to pick up on that one?
I think I can give a quick answer. I think, you know, a polluter pays sort of mentality is it's kind of the biggest stick that we probably want to avoid. But when we're not getting those consistent carrots, Stuart, I think I think we will get to that point. So okay. Yeah.
Any other thoughts on that? Alison, have you got any thoughts on that?
I mean, I agree with Rebecca. I think it's probably going to be inevitable. But again, I mean, I would prefer to see a holistic approach, stopping silos, stop looking at carbon in isolation, and start looking at environmental net gain, which is what our environmental 25-year plan set out to do. It's one piece of the puzzle. I think it will end up being necessary.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, a question from Craig of Prime PLC. Collection of data has been mentioned a few times as being key to the issue. However, is there a danger of collecting too much data? And if so, how should this be managed? Emma, thank you.
Well, I think you can never have too much data. I think data is incredibly powerful, but it's a pertinent point. You need a system to collect and capture your data. And I think people need to think about the tech and the tools that enable them to do that, because having your data on random Excel spreadsheets and then trying to analyze what is coming out of your data is very difficult. But there are lots of tools that are available now in the market that allow you to visualize data. We, for example, within our business, we use the Microsoft suite of tools, so we use Power BI. But it's definitely important that you're able to see it in a way that's readable so that you can understand it and then work out how to explore the benefits of having that data.
Okay. I'm going to move on to a question from Andy Bailey of Poole Dick Associates. Actually, there's two questions here. When the panel talks about net zero carbon, are they referencing cradle to grave or in use, and what percentage is this adding to development cost? Rebecca.
I knew you were going to come to me then. I think at the moment we're predominantly talking around operational net zero, so it's that we're not quite at whole life carbon. Whole life net zero carbon yet, which would be the cradle to grave sort of side of it, because that includes the embodied carbon emissions, and I think we're just not in that. We're not quite there yet in terms of people offering that. I think we're measuring it. We're looking at it. We understand what we can do to start to drive that down, but I would think there would be very few people that could claim to be whole life carbon net zero at the moment in terms of developments.
Thank you. Alison, you have a comment.
I think that's going to become increasingly important in the planning context. I think developers are going to be expected to start to really pull together a way of assessing their whole life cycle emissions for a particular project as part and parcel of being able to get planning permission. I think that's something that is coming down the road very fast. Just come into the London plan, hasn't it? The whole life carbon assessment is now a London plan requirement. So yeah, I think others will follow suit, undoubtedly.
Here's a good question from Ben Christian, planning consultant at Vale Williams. From an environmental perspective, do you feel let down by the government due to a lack of proactivity and ambition to bring in environmental enhancement, e.g. lack of targets in the Environment Bill and the Green Homes funding provision not being successful in practice? Too much talk and not enough action. Who wants to respond to that? Alison.
I think the quick answer is yes. I mean, I'm dismayed by the delays to the Environment Bill in particular, and obviously even with if it gets passed eventually, once it moves through Parliament, obviously there are weaknesses in the drafting in terms of the targets that are going to be adopted within that particular act. That said, I think that there'll be a lot coming through statutory instruments once the actual main act's been adopted, so I think it'll be very much a watch this space. But I also have concerns about the Office for Environmental Protection and what's that going to look like in terms of actually, making local authorities, public bodies, take on the role that they do need to take, and on obviously having some enforcement powers, having real teeth to deal with that in the way that the European Commission would have done had we not left the European Union.
Yeah. Any other thoughts and observations on this question? It's a big question. You know, government, too much talk, not enough action. Sophie, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of the same answer to Alison, that yes, you know, it is a letdown that all these things are sort of promised and then not taken away. I mean, it's good to have carrots, but you need them to sort of be there and not just snatched away at the last minute. So I think there'll be a lot upcoming in the next couple of years, but to how effective that is and if it works in practice is another question. So I guess we'll just see how it progresses.
Okay, thank you. A couple of anonymous questions here. Could panel share their thoughts on the existing stock within our built environment, with the majority of our buildings achieving way under net zero functionality and use? How much of a priority is retrofitting and returning to our older developments? I'm going to come to Rebecca. I'm going to come to Emma. Thank you.
I mean, it's a really good question, because the UK built environment, and particularly residential homes, they just aren't fit for the future. And there's going to have to be a tremendous amount of work done in order to make them energy efficient ready. And a lot of the built environment comprises standing portfolio type investments where they don't necessarily sit within the control of one person, or if they do, the landlords themselves may not have control over the portfolio. They may be reliant on their tenants. You know, something that came up from one of your earlier conversations was what type of embodied carbon are we talking about? And for a lot of developers, it's very difficult to look beyond the carbon regulated, because they don't necessarily know who the end occupier is going to be, and they can design a building in a specific way, but they don't know that occupationally that they will use it in the way it was intended. And quite often they will exit the asset at that point, and it then goes on to belong to another portfolio. So having the whole life approach is even more difficult. So I'm hoping maybe we'll see some more framework and some more understanding coming out of COP26 as to what we do regards the current built environment.
Thank you. Moving on, another anonymous question. How can we improve energy performance in listed buildings with the obvious heritage constraints? Who would like to put the hand up for that question, please? Thank you, Alison.
Well, the obvious point is it's very difficult. I mean, what we really need is to have, I think, a skill set with listed building conservation officers at local planning authorities to work with industry to come up with solutions that can actually work for those listed buildings, so that we can maintain that heritage asset and not lose any of its value, but at the same time make sure that it's actually not going to be, you know, effectively a damaging asset from an environmental perspective. But it is a very difficult square to circle, and I think it does need some real attention.
Okay.
There is an existing paper by the BRE on this exact area, which I would probably direct. I don't have a name because the question was anonymous too, but that's actually quite good reading on that topic, so would recommend that as a first point of call.
Just a question from Subject Jassy. Good morning, Subject. Are there any particularly good examples of net zero development that the audience could look to? Any particular good precedents here? Case studies? Any particular thoughts on shining examples of this? Emma.
Well, whether or not they're shining examples, I'm not sure, but certainly if you're looking at logistics and warehousing, they are perhaps an easier asset to look to make net zero carbon, particularly if you have the opportunity to put an array of photovoltaics across the roof. And as we spoke about before, having dual metering on the site so that you can draw from the renewable energy when it's available. bearing in mind, you know, you do have the intermittency of solar, so you will often need to go back to draw from the grid. But if people were to look at some of the examples that are out there at the moment, I know that we have one of our developments. I think the stat is that we have 72 football pitches worth of PVs running across the roof. They're a very good place to start, and I think we're going to see an evolution in battery storage within the next couple of years, and that will also assist greatly because you won't need the size of footprint that you currently need to have.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to add one more question before we come to a close from Penny. Hello, Penny, in two places. Do you think that neighbourhood plans can have a vital role in encouraging sustainable developments through their policies? Rebecca, I'm going to come to you.
Yes, my experience of neighbourhood plans is that they need to be consulted on properly, and that, you know, there's the issue around sort of site allocation that comes into them sometimes, and then a sort of an improper process for trying to get those in place. So yes, because they are absolutely embedded in the communities that are going to be affected by development, and so they are, you know, best placed to, you know, they're in the thick of it. Quite how will be different depending on different locations.
Okay, thank you for that. And time's upon us. It doesn't seem as if we've started before we finish, but I'm going to have to draw things to a close, I'm afraid. Big thanks to all the panel this morning, to you, Alison, to Emma, Rebecca and Sophie, and for all your contributions this morning. Thank you. We know that many seminars trying to tackle this subject take 2.5 hours to scratch the surface, so we've given ourselves a ridiculous challenge, but you've coped superbly. Thank you. Thanks to all of you out there for joining us, and I'm sorry we couldn't deal with all the questions, a few more coming in, but I hope you've got something out of the session today. Please complete the survey for us. We want to do it on your behalf. It's Hydrock collaborating with you, and we thought it would be useful to understand what your thoughts and priorities are, and we'll share our analysis back with you. If you're interested, you can view all Hydrock's previous webinars on the website www.hydrock.com/webinars. I think that's it. I just want to say keep well. You can see that spring is in the air. I'm sure we've all got a good sunshine day out there today. Make the most of it. Have a good Easter, and let's reach for the great unlocking. Cheers. Bye.